All right, and we are live. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, panelists. Today, we're having a discussion titled Exploring Ethereum's Correlation Risk. This is based on a report which was titled Ethereum's Correlation Risks, Poorly Understood but Always Present. That was a report which was also a collaboration between Liquid Collective and Obol. So if you're looking for something to read during your morning coffee, or maybe you want to kind of revisit this conversation that we have today, you can check out the Liquid Collective blog or the Obol blog for that report. But yeah, today's discussion we'll be talking about client risks, staking network dynamics, and mitigations for stakers and node operators. And we have quite the panel here. I'm actually quite excited, maybe even a little starstruck, I will admit. So I'll do some introductions quickly. My name is Max Sherwood. I'm Content and Communications Manager at DV Labs, formerly known as Obol Labs. So I guess I'll start at the top left of my screen. We've got Jim McDonald joining from Attestant. He's the CTO there. Attestant is an institutional staking provider. Jim, if you don't know him, he's the creator of Vouch and Dirk. That's a validator client and a key signer, which allows node operators to make use of fault tolerance and protect themselves against slashing. So quite an important piece of infrastructure. Next, below Jim, we've got Jorge Arce, researcher at Nethermind. And what's interesting is he recently led a team that published a research report called Allowing Validators to Provide Client Information Privately. And this proposed some changes to the Ethereum protocol to allow validators to safely and privately disclose their client software. So we'll talk about that in a second. Welcome, Jorge. Then we've got David Turnbull from Alluvial. He's a senior site reliability engineer. He's an experienced DevOps engineer whose previous experience included head of SRE at BlockDemon. And now he's working to support the Liquid Collective, which is an institutional liquid staking protocol. Welcome, David. And finally, last but not least, we have Oisín Kyne, co-founder and CTO at DV Labs, previously known as Obol Labs. He's a creator of Charon, the only infrastructure-agnostic distributed validator middleware on the market, which allows node operators to run validators via a cluster of nodes with different client and geographic combinations built directly into the validator. So welcome, Oisín. Yeah, so let's dive straight into the conversation. First, just at a high level to kind of remind everyone why these topics are important. I guess I'll ask Oisín, why is network diversity and decentralization important to Ethereum?
Yeah, it's a good question to kind of start with. I think one of the main use cases for blockchains in general is that they're always on and highly available. Ethereum more or less has never gone down in the 9 or so years that it's been running, bar a few times where it was like under some load through some abuses. And this is something that is the main use case for blockchains. So why is diversity of clients and decentralization important? It's frankly to prevent blockchains going down. So as we're going to talk about over this hour, there's quite a number of ways that software can fail. And what we really want to have happen is that no more than 1/3 of the network failing at any one time, preferably obviously even less. But if that happens, the network can tolerate it and can still keep producing blocks, keep finalizing, keep working as expected. And that's probably the main reason that we work about correlation. We'll talk a bit about how we achieve that, what incentives there are, and so on from there. But yeah, you want your blockchain to be online. You don't want your blockchain to halt. You would like to be able to use it when you want to use it. And that's probably what most of us spend our time here worrying about.
Right, good answer. So software can fail, hardware can fail. We want a good mix of everything to make sure that Ethereum as a whole never fails. So a big piece of this is client diversity, right? There's a number of execution clients and a number of consensus clients that a validator node needs to run. Clientdiversity.org currently shows that we're down to 55% for Geth, and Nethermind is 28%, which is quite a big improvement over the previous years. I won't dive into all the consensus client numbers, but they're also quite good, roughly a third Prism, a third Lighthouse, and then Teku and Nimbus making up another third. But Jorge, I wanted to ask you this because I know this was part of your research. The numbers we see on clientdiversity.org, they're not really exact, are they? They're more of a guess. Can you kind of explain, how much confidence do we have in knowing, what the percentages are of clients running on the Ethereum nodes on the network?
Thank you. You don't know how much I love the opportunity to answer this question or try to shed some light into this. Okay, yeah. So you go to client diversity and you see this neat dashboard with statistics for consensus clients and execution clients. And they provide the sources as well as to how this data is gathered. I would actually, this is a pretty interesting thing to do. I would encourage people to look into these sources, like, for example, Blockprint, Mega Labs, Supermajority.info, or so on and so forth. And there's quite a few things that come out. I'm going to start with one, which is, well, actually, let's start with the execution clients as you did, right? So if you go to like right now in the client diversity page, it shows Geth at 55% and Nethermind at 28%. If you go to the original source, supermajority.info, you'll see that, well, this is a survey. So we are asking big node operators like what software they're running. And there's actually a huge margin of tolerance or uncertainty if you go to the original source. Like if you go to supermajority.info, it says that Geth has, like, we can estimate the distribution from a minimum of 23% to a maximum of 64%. And it's somewhere in the middle. And that's like a huge margin, right? And it says that Nethermind is at a minimum of 23.4% and a maximum of 63.7%. So not as different as from what the numbers that I just gave for Geth, right? So what they do is they assume that when there's missing data in the surveys, they kind of like fill it in with Geth because that's the most likely answer. But there's really such a huge like margin of error here that it's very dangerous to like say that, okay, Geth's at 55%, Nethermind's at 28%. The uncertainty is there and it's quite large. Which is why, as part of the research we're working on, we think that the Ethereum community would benefit from having like a more canonical method to gather this data. And the second thing I wanted to say, which is actually a bit of a pet peeve at this point, because it's very common and it can skew the numbers one way or another. If we take away one thing from reading client diversity numbers, I would say people to pay attention to the difference between client diversity of validators and client diversity of nodes. So let me explain what I mean. If you go to clientdiversity.org and you compare Blockprint's numbers, for example, with Mega Labs' numbers, you'll see there's a huge disparity. And for Mega Labs, Lighthouse is winning at 42%, and for Blockprint, Prism is winning at 34%. The reason is these two statistics are measuring different things, and this is not really explained anywhere. When we are using crawlers to query the nodes, we're not really weighing in how much of impact, how much voting power they have on consensus. To do that, you need to somehow keep track of how many validators are connecting to a single node. So it's not the same that there's a node with 200 validators connected to it or a node that is connected to 10 validators. And this is a reason why statistics like Ether nodes in the past, which was the most common one before client diversity, was highly inaccurate because we weren't making this distinction. So yeah, a lot of factors and misconceptions when it comes to assessing client diversity. There's a lot we can do better.
Right, and that's a good point, that really what we're interested in if we're trying to quantify the risk on the network is, you know, the risk that the network fails to come to consensus as a result of a client bug, right? So it's really not the number of nodes per se. It's actually the stake weight, if you want to call it that, attached to those nodes.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, we're talking about risks. So I would turn to David and ask about supermajority clients. So I think we've seen the Geth percentage, you know, estimated again, come down from something like 80% to 55% in the past 2 years. So where is that kind of critical percentage that we need to worry about, and what is actually the risk of a supermajority client?
Yeah, thanks, Max, for asking that question. Yeah, so a supermajority is essentially two-thirds or more of the network being controlled by a single client. And what that really means is that we could reach consensus using that client without the remaining network. So that's really critical to think about, because if software a bug introduced that potentially causes that software to validate blocks that are invalid, it could cause massive problems on the network, right? Additionally, you know, it could cause a massive outage, which would then result in a massive correlated slashing event, right? loss of trust on the network, reputational damage, and then I think what really people worry about is a double signing event, where people are, the bug in the software, shall I say, is creating conflicting blocks or preventing the validator from performing the duties of proposing blocks and voting on blocks. So there's a real kind of risk to the network if we have a vast majority of clients that are the same, which is why we need to think about kind of de-risking that by client diversity and decentralization.
Right. Okay. So there are a couple of things to unpack here. I think some of the incidents that we've seen in the past have been relatively minor. So I remember in a few months ago, for example, 8% of the validators on the network were taken offline because Nethermind had a bug, but that's just 8% of the network going offline, right? So that didn't really affect Ethereum's ability to, produce blocks, finalize blocks, et cetera. But then we had the Prism event, which was maybe more interesting, which was a finalization failure. So the network was still producing blocks, but they weren't being finalized. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And I think the mitigation against this is the fact that we don't have like a centralized entity that's distributing updates to these clients. It's kind of up to the individual node operators and individuals that are running validators to update their software. So we're kind of protected in that sense. It's not going to be like another CrowdStrike incident where an update is pushed out and people are taken offline, right? It's kind of, we have protection in the fact that people are and institutions and node operators are responsible for updating their own software.
Right. So we have many different client softwares going around and many different versions as well. Sorry, Oisín, to interrupt.
I find it funny. I think I saw a lot of Ethereum people dunking on Windows with the CrowdStrike thing, but based on our numbers, about 90% plus of people are running Ubuntu. So I wouldn't kind of count our chickens before they hatch. We're like, all happy with our clients, but not our operating systems.
I didn't know whether saying CrowdStrike was too soon and people were still emotionally scarred from the event, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it goes to show like people like to hate on our industry, but it's all fun and games until stock markets and hospitals are no longer able to rely on critical infrastructure, right?
But it also highlights the fact that software bugs happen and blockchains are not immune to this, and that's why it's really important that we don't have a massive majority of one particular client, right? Because I think Jim's going to talk about correlated slashing in a minute, but it could essentially have big financial consequences.
Yeah, so let's turn to Jim and talk about the doomsday scenario. So David, in his answer, mentioned forking of the chain and some of the rather nasty things that can happen. So I think probably correlated slashing is the one that people have heard about. Maybe we should just start there, Jim. What is correlated slashing? Why does it exist? And is it overblown, or is it something we should actually worry about?
Sure, no, it's a great place to chat about, because ultimately, certainly when we talk to people, the whole idea of slashing is an area that's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of confusion, and obviously the scariest thing out there. The last thing you want to be doing when you're staking is lose your capital. So if we look at the Ethereum network since Genesis on the consensus side, which was back in December 2020, we've seen 450 different sort of slashing events happen in terms of validators being told they've done something wrong and as a result of that being removed from the network. Ethereum cannot tell the difference between a misconfiguration, a mistake, an operational error, and an intentional attack. In this case, we can say that even though we've seen over sort of 400 validators be slashed, there has been no intentional attack on the network since Genesis. And the reason we can say that is because, as we've discussed, there's this idea of needing, a large percentage of the network to actually be able to enforce a change. In this case, you would need at least 1/3 of the network to change their mind in equivalent about how the network looks, about how the chain looks. You'd need at least 1/3 of those to all change their mind and all change their mind in the same way for there to be a real effective attack. So on the one hand, As we've said, we've seen over 400 validators be slashed. They've been punished, but equally we've not seen an attack. So although the network itself cannot discriminate between someone making an operational mistake, running the keys on two different computers at the same time, or someone actively trying to attack the network, what it can do is it can look at the magnitude of that attack and say, okay, well, how likely was this to have some level of impact? As we've mentioned, you need at least 1/3 of the validators that are currently active to be able to change their mind. If they do that, they are then eligible for slashing, because again, it's a blockchain. All the information is held on the blockchain. You can see an original vote, you can see a changed vote. The combination of those two things allow slashing events to be generated. So if we've seen, and we do commonly see every 2 weeks, 3 weeks roughly, there's a slashing event of some description. It's usually just a single validator, maybe 2 validators, maybe a handful of validators, but that's compared to over 1 million active validators today on the network. In percentage terms, you're not getting very close to this 33% number. So because of that, there is a fixed penalty that's taken away from the validator, but then there's also this correlation penalty. And that correlation penalty basically says, well, how close to this 33% number have we got? Because that suggests that tells us how close to a real attack there's been, or a real attack that's been capable of potentially altering the chain. Again, as we said, the reality is we see these in dribs and drabs, 1s and 2s. So that correlated penalty at the moment for virtually every slashing event that has happened is near enough 0. We have had a couple of events where there's been 20, 30, 40 different validators at the same time. That gives us a slight increase in penalty, but again, it's not a lot. To have a real impact, you'd be looking at tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of validators being slashed within a relatively short time frame. That hasn't happened. Obviously, if it did happen, there are areas where we have to consider that. Could it be a real attack? Well, maybe. But again, given the type of infrastructure that people run today, larger centralized systems, we know in terms of validator breakdown, there are a few players out there that run 5, 10, 12% of the network all by themselves. If they created some system internally, either through operational error or through client error, which caused a slashing event across all of those validators, that would be a significant spike. It would take a significant portion of their total ether. We haven't seen that yet, but again, as we've heard from everyone else, it's important to keep these client percentage numbers down. It's important to have diversity. It's important to reduce our exposure to any one single system potentially having an error that could cause slashing events, because that's the only way we can be sure that we're protecting, obviously our own funds and the network itself. And again, as David mentioned, the reliability of the network is very, very important, but also it's the optics. By not having had a slashing event of any significant magnitude, by not being susceptible to an attack since the genesis of the chain, it sends a very, very strong message that this is actually a good system. This is a system that works well. And it's very important for us to have that information to be able to continue to say to people, yep, we're confident that this hasn't happened. We're confident that if it did happen or started to happen, the costs involved would be massive. And as a result of that, it incentivizes each individual user, each individual validator to do their own work to ensure that they reduce their own slashing risk as much as possible.
Yeah, thanks for that answer. And that's something that we wrote in the report as well. It's like, even if you're not directly affected by correlated slashing, it's just a bad look for the whole network, right? If a significant portion of ETH is getting burned and the ETH market cap is decreasing as a result, it would be all over the news. So even if you're just holding ETH and not even staking ETH, it would be a bad day. The price of ETH would go down. It would be a bad look for the whole network. So staying on the correlated slashing theme here, you mentioned that there's no way for Ethereum to know if it's slashing a validator who has, made a simple mistake or misconfigured itself, or is actually part of a coordinated attack, and it needs to punish those validators regardless. So I'd like to ask Oisín, do you think that these correlated slashing penalties, the fact that they exist, has it actually encouraged client diversity? Has it actually encouraged node operators to use minority clients? or is it just kind of off to the side, and is it creating a kind of a long tail risk that doesn't even go away with 4 to 5 clients, because we need even more clients than that?
It's a tricky one to answer. I would say the correlated slashings themselves haven't changed anything, but the threat of them has changed the social layer, and the social layer has kind of, motivated people to, work hard to produce stuff. I think in particular, the biggest risk is a supermajority failure. In this case, where more than 66% of people do something weird and like sign something incorrect, to go back to the correct chain, all of them lose all of their stake. And that's kind of by far and away the worst case. Imagine 2/3 of, all of this like proof of stake getting slashed. That'd be, pretty insane. However, it really has some effect. We've seen, Get come down from like the 90s down to, potentially under 66%. This is a good start. I think 4 to 5 clients is enough from a client diversity perspective, but there's way more points of centralization than just the clients that can fail. Kind of case in point, we've seen CrowdStrike. We're very exposed to like lots of the most popular, Ubuntu, like in similar like operating systems. But I think more could be done to make people, change behavior. And this is probably where we're going to talk a bit next around liveness, like correlated liveness penalties, which is different from a slashing. So slashing, as we've kind of touched on twice or 3 times now, is if you're doing something malicious, the network can't tell if it's, malice or incompetence, but there's, a more minor penalty of just going offline. And that happens kind of regularly. We've had, at least I think twice in the last few years, had like a situation where more than 33% of the network have gone offline. And that means we lose finality. It's not, the end of the world. It recovers in a while when people get their nodes fixed. But that alone right now isn't particularly penalized. It's, bad day in the office, but it doesn't really like change behavior. And what we're starting to discuss as we're trying to figure out how do we really change behavior is trying to penalize people when they have a liveness outage. So if you go offline at the same time as everyone else, that is certainly not as bad as, like some sort of malicious like double signing, but we do want to, penalize it to try and move the needle. So there's discussion around bringing in correlated liveness penalties, where the amount of rewards you lose while you're offline gets more significant if more people are also offline. So if you are one entity that has a full 5% and all of your machines go all offline at the same time, you'd want to get pretty heavily penalized rather than not particularly. And I'm a big believer that it's like people are very bad at long tail risks. They don't really, like, everyone kind of knows about this correlated slashing, but people don't really change until we see one. And we haven't had a correlated slashing of like any significant magnitude so far. So bringing in liveness penalties and having someone say, oh, I went offline because a major exchange that runs a large percent of the network went offline and I lost 6 months of rewards for doing so. I'm going to move to a new, long tail staking solution that even if they go offline, I won't lose 6 months. I might lose, an hour or a day's worth of rewards. That I think will change behavior more than correlated slashing risks, which, do by like second order effects on the social layer. But I don't think humans are good with long tail risks at all. So I think, upping the risks on the liveness side, I think will be a big help in this and, will change behavior more than we've currently seen.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'd like to get your perspective, David, as someone who's familiar with running infrastructure. I guess it would be possible, let's say, for example, a big provider has many validators running on nodes in a certain data center. And even if they have multiple clients in use, and are fairly protected against a failure with one client, the whole data center could go offline, right? So there would still be a centralization aspect there. I think it was actually Vitalik that proposed this correlated attestation penalty originally. Where do you kind of fall? Do you think it would encourage centralized providers to change how they run their infrastructure, or do you think it'll change the way stakers choose providers? What's your take here?
Yeah, just building on Oisín's point there, I think the feeling is that the correlated slashing events didn't go deep enough, didn't go far enough to incentivize better decentralization. So this proposal is about kind of adding that penalty to kind of the more mundane actions of a validator, like attestations. And how it works is by keeping a rolling average of the missed attestations in a block, sorry, in an epoch even, and applying penalties to any attestations that are above that number, and that's aimed at kind of reducing this economies of scale that you get from infrastructure. So, like you said, running infrastructure, there is an economy of scale by being able to run a lot of validators on a single machine in a single data center. It's easy, it's repeatable, and with the way that infrastructure development has kind of gone over the last 10 years, where we're kind of taught to look after infrastructure like cattle rather than pets, where you don't have to kind of constantly massage and keep this server alive, and you want to go to more an ephemeral infrastructure, which is where DBT would help massively. But yeah, I think it's definitely something that will go in some way to help reduce that economy of scale and encourage the better diversity of clients and better decentralization. But I think to measure the impact, I think we need to kind of see over a long period of time to figure out if that's going to actually work properly or not, and encourage more decentralization.
I'd like to just add something here again. Is that one of the ideas of doing correlated attestation penalties is that at the moment rewards are relatively low. They're not massive, which means your penalties for not attesting are relatively low as well.
Yeah.
And that's true not for any individual stake. We've talked about a single large entity, but there's other diversification risks that we care about. So we can have 20 different staking providers or large stakers or whatever, but if they're all running on AWS and AWS goes down, there's an impact there. So rather than try to focus on each individual potential risk, and we've done very well with that with clients and supermajority, but now we're expanding beyond that. What we would love to be able to do is just say, okay, look, with this whole idea of correlated attestation penalties, you need to think about the entirety of your risk, not just the validators you're running. You could be running one validator, but if you're running one validator on the same infrastructure or with the same points of failure as another 50,000 validators, then you've got that level of risk. And so you need to start considering how you can diversify, geographically, operating systems, clients, et cetera, and really build the whole lot in together. Regardless of how good your own infrastructure is, you've got to worry about everyone else's as well. Like we said, there's no point having the best infrastructure out there if you're sitting on the same server rack as a whole bunch of other guys who don't, because you've got this potential of losing everything and having a much higher penalty as a result. So correlated attestation penalties, we can't easily increase rewards, but we can increase the penalties, and this gives people more of the thinking along the lines of, as we said, not on a slashing event, not in an attack or pseudo attack on the network, but just in the world of keeping this thing running every 12 seconds, getting a new block and getting the attestations into it. In that world, it's making sure that we again have the best operational diversity that we possibly can, and as we said, it's doing that by saying to people, look, think about it. Think about how you can insulate yourself from everyone else's risk as well as yours, because that's the critical thing. And obviously, this works very well for everyone, right? If I don't know, AWS and Google Cloud and everyone else, they all merge together or something, then everyone has to think about it. Let's say we lose 2 of the 4 clients off the consensus side. Everyone has to think about it. It's not a case of the finger pointing. And one of the things that did happen with client diversity was there was a lot of finger pointing. Hey, these guys over here are running Geth and that makes them bad or whatever else. One of the things we saw, interestingly, is that most of the client diversity that moved from Geth moved to Nethermind. So now Nethermind's actually approaching 33% usage. So just doing one single action is not enough. It's a process, and it's a very dynamic process. And by putting in these, like we said, these kind of higher penalties, it really allows the community to have to think about it and have a valid cost to say, I need to upgrade my network, I need to move to a different provider, I need to move to a different geographical region, because there's a real cost now potentially to not doing that.
Yeah, and I definitely think that we'll see node operators absolutely diversifying their cloud providers and even going to smaller data centers. And I know from my time at Blockdaemon, that's exactly what they were doing. They had nodes in data centers, they had nodes in Google Cloud, AWS, different regions across the entire globe. So yeah, I absolutely think that that's the way to go if you're a node operator and you want to optimize your rewards, for sure.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys, for those answers. Really, really thorough. So it makes sense, I guess, from the node operator's point of view to think, how much of my stack is correlated with the rest of the network? How do I avoid that? And then, it's up to the protocol, I guess, to encourage decentralization via these penalties. Jorge, maybe you can, I know as part of your research, you actually proposed a change to the Ethereum protocol. We're maybe familiar at a high level with the EIP, the Ethereum Improvement Protocol process. Another big one coming up is the max effective balance, which has been a pretty popular topic in these circles recently. So maybe we can touch on max effective balance, also called max EB. What is it? Do you think it'll change slashing in a significant way? Can you maybe just open that topic for us?
Absolutely. So let's begin with saying what max EB is. In all caps, you may have seen it written around. So this is just a parameter in Ethereum's beacon chain design. It determines what's the maximum amount of voting power that a single validator can have in the protocol. And it's contrasted with the actual balance that the validator has accrued in terms of its rewards. And so, like, a validator can continue to accrue rewards beyond 32 ETH. So I don't know, 40, 50, 64 ETH. That doesn't make it have any more of a say on Ethereum's protocol in terms of voting power. So the voting power is capped at 32 ETH in the current design, which is, by the way, equal to the amount of ETH that you require to set up the validator in the first place. Now, this is not the only possible design. In fact, there are other blockchains in which validators are allowed to consolidate a lot of voting power into one single entity. And this is more of a legacy design coming back from the days of sharding, which we're not going to get into. But nowadays, since we're not going in that direction, we can revisit this conversation about what the max effective balance parameter is, and we can look into changing it. And this is where we enter EIP 7251, which is increased max effective balance. And it's a lot more subtle than one would think. Like, initially, I thought it was a no-brainer. And then I started seeing the discussions around, like, the consequences that might come from changing this, or do we have to tread carefully, as with any EIP, of course, right? So let's talk about the good. Let's talk about what needs to be considered carefully. The good thing about increasing the max effective balance is, well, first of all, there's going to be a lot more simplicity for node operators. If they can manage up to 2,000 ETH into a single validator, and currently to manage that much power, they need 64 keys at a time, right? So it's going to bring simplicity from the point of view of infra. Also, let's think about the peer-to-peer network on Ethereum side. That's going to be many less messages that are flying around at all times. It's going to bring down the network overhead and sort of like the demands on aggregators and so on and so forth. So that's good. Already we're dealing with like roughly 1 million validators, 1 million entities that need to be signing these messages, sending them through the peer-to-peer network, getting in touch with attestation aggregators. This is a very complex and optimized process that needs to happen every 12 seconds, every slot. It's quite a feat of engineering that it happens so quickly and so efficiently. So by increasing the max effective balance, we can bring them down a little bit, those loads on the network. That said, okay, what are the downsides here? If you put yourself in the shoes of the node operator, imagine that you have a client failure of some sort, and there's some kind of execution client that proposes a bad block, or there's some kind of consensus client that makes you double sign for whatever reason because of a bug. Imagine that you have, I don't know, something like 64 validators, and you're the node operator, and you run them at a time. If this happens in this scenario, then your validators, given that validators only have to attest in one slot per epoch, your validators are sort of like going to be staggered over the course of the whole epoch as they come in a test, right? So if you're monitoring your validators as you should as an operator, you'll be able to notice that something is wrong. I don't know, 1 slot in, 2 slots in, you'll be able to set in some or activate some contingency measures, shut down the validators, and maybe get just slashed on a handful of those. Gets just a fraction of your whole staking balance is going to undergo the slashing penalties. If you consolidate everything into a single gargantuan validator that has like 2,000 ETH, and you keep slashing penalties as they are, which is the initial slashing penalty is going to be 1/32 times the amount of balance on the validator, then you don't have access to, or you are not able to apply the strategy that I just described. You just get slashed up front for a huge amount of balance. You're not able to sort of like monitor in real time what's going on with your validators and push that sort of like shutdown button. Which means that as a node operator, you have to think carefully how you consolidate. This is just one reason why you need to do that, but other reasons include, like Jim was saying before, you need to make sure that your infra is diversified enough. You need to make sure, ideally, you're going to be running a variety of clients and not just running everything under a huge node that only has one combination of client software. Okay, all that said, there's also going to be, it's likely there's going to be pressure on, at least in conversations with the Lido team that we had a while ago, this was a topic that came up. It may be the case that there's pressure on big node operators to consolidate, because this is sort of like, people may perceive this as the altruistic thing to do so as to bring down the loads on the network or so. But I have described also from the other side, from the other point of view, what are some of the concerns about just consolidating everything into huge validators and how that can increase the upfront risks of getting slashed and so. So because of this, there's still discussion as to what should happen with the slashing penalties. Should we maybe adjust the penalty, not make it equal to 1/32 times the current balance? Should we make it something like an upfront number, like just 1 ETH per validator or so? It's not straightforward how we should proceed here, and there's still room for discussion there. I'm looking forward to see how this plays out as this EIP becomes merged into the Ethereum protocol, because it does have a lot of benefits, but it's important to think about the subtleties. I hope I addressed the question. Let me know if there's any follow-up points that would make sense to look into.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks. So some pros, simplifying, reducing the number of validators, being able to consolidate all those validator keys into one, but also some cons in that you lose, your canary network, if you will, where some validators are failing and you can shut off the rest before it's too late. So as with any big change to the Ethereum protocol itself, I assume this will be debated for a while, and it's not going to get pushed through in a day, which is a good thing. Do you have any idea on timelines? I mean, I know this is kind of a classic question for ETHDES, right? Is asking them for timelines, but is there any indication? I'm kind of out of the loop here.
To my understanding, it's coming in the next hard fork in Pectra, correct?
Okay, cool. Yeah, MaxEB, I guess, does anyone else have anything else to add on MaxEB before we move on? Maybe later if it comes to you. So yeah, I guess, are there any other changes? Let's ask Jim here. Are there any other changes to network dynamics that may affect these these risks and correlations? Restaking in particular is a big topic these days. I don't know if you have any thoughts there, if it's relevant, if it's not relevant. Is there anything else on your mind that's changing in Ethereum today?
I mean, yeah, restaking is an interesting area. So everything we've talked about today has been what we think about as in protocol. So this is defined in consensus specs, it's implemented in the client. There's really no leeway in it. When we look at something like restaking, it really sits on a layer above that. Maybe it's a smart contract, maybe it's just a social grouping that decide on this. But what you're doing is adding new slashing conditions on top of what exists in the protocol. It won't impact the protocol directly, but there can be lots of impact sort of around it. So we'll take a simple example. Let's say that there's a new AVS up and running. So EigenLayer is the obvious example of a restaking protocol. And for whatever reason, there is a slashing event that happens inside that protocol. Well, one of the things that potentially happens there is you require ETH to be removed from the validators. You can't do that in protocol. So what you have to do is exit the validators, take some ETH off the money that comes back, and then allow the validators to re-enter if they want. That could potentially affect the exit queue. So there's only a certain number of validators allowed to exit from Ethereum every epoch. If for some reason a very large or popular sort of restaking protocol has an issue, you might be forcing, thousands, tens of thousands of validators to go through this process of exiting and then theoretically coming back in and re-entering again. So now you're on the entry queue as well. So you have these kind of two queues, and if these queues are busy, and it's been seen before, it makes people wary. People don't necessarily want to stake if it's going to take them 3 weeks before they start earning rewards. People are uncomfortable unstaking if it's going to take 3 weeks until they see their funds. That matters in particular when we now have things like ETFs, because liquidity provisions in and around ETFs are very, very important. The ability to make sure you can get your funds out in a suitable time matter. If for whatever reason something like restaking kicks in and there's a much higher flow of validators through the exit queue as a result, either as a single entity when there's a failure, or just as part of the operations where we see changes in what we would consider the extra protocol slashing conditions that might make people say, look, I don't want to be here anymore. One of the reasons why, again, Ethereum's validator set is quite stable in terms of not having a large number leave is because the rules are very well written down. They're set. Everyone understands them. If there is going to be a change, it's months and months, normally, a year plus in the making. So because of all of these things, it's very, very useful to understand that you've got, a very solid and stable and clearly understood mechanism. Restaking is an example of something that potentially changes that by forcing changes to the validator set outside of those protocols. So there's certainly areas where we could start to see a little bit more turbulence around entrance and exit. As a result of that, it could have knock-on effects, as we say, in things like ETFs. The willingness of an ETF, and at the moment they can't stake, but if you imagine that they can stake, maybe they'll be like, right, well, I'm going to put in 10% of my ether into staking, so I got 90% of it liquid in case I need to do redemptions. If it's more stable, maybe there'll be 50% or 70%. So there will be a larger impact as we have more extra protocol systems come in. And again, as Jorge mentioned, things around MaxEB start to come into play as well. And again, it's a fascinating area. Unfortunately, it looks like at the moment one of the best things to do with MaxEB is to let everyone else consolidate their validators into large validators, and you stay on small ones. You get the network reduction from everyone else consolidating their validators, but you retain your slashing protection from having lots of small validators, right? The trouble, of course, that is that if everyone does that, no one consolidates. So there's always going to be these areas that start to get interesting. Equally, as Jorge mentioned, if slashing is a fixed amount per validator, regardless of the amount of ETH behind it, then you're into a world which encourages consolidation, discourages solo stakers and home stakers, and obviously that's somewhere that as a community Ethereum doesn't want to go. So yeah, there's all of these different areas that suddenly start to become a little bit more complex. And again, exiting a validator that's got 2048 ether on it is a different beast to exiting one that's got 32 ether on it. So there are areas there that are also potentially more complicated. And again, although MaxEB is coming in, there's other areas, and we've talked about exiting and re-entering validators. At this moment in time, the list of validators only grows. So if I exit a validator and then come back into it, well, the problem there is that I've got my old entry for my old validator still listed in the state table, and I got my new entry for my new validator listed in the state table. And so I've just doubled my entries in this table. This table keeps growing. So although we've got like 1 million active validators, the table's at 1.2, 1.25 or something million entries, and that will only keep growing. So again, as we try to make the system more dynamic, potentially we have a larger scale impact across the board for client teams to try and keep up with. And there's areas like that. And like we say, gathering state takes longer. It's a bigger piece. So syncing takes longer, et cetera, et cetera. So there are always different knock-on effects in different areas. And again, as Jorge kind of lined. There's always a trade-off between keeping things static and simple and making them more dynamic, more usable potentially for a wider range of people, but at the same time potentially increasing the background stress. So yeah, lots of things that can potentially cause more stresses to the network, not necessarily directly in and around slashing, but certainly in the areas around that.
Yeah, lots to consider, and Ethereum's always a moving target. I think the goal is to get to ossification one day, but that's definitely not anytime soon, I think. Let's shift the conversation now a little bit toward mitigation. So I think we've talked a lot about risks, risks to stakers, to node operators alike, risks to the Ethereum network itself. But many of the audience members might be stakers. They're looking for either a node operator or multiple node operators. Maybe they're even considering a liquid staking protocol. It's funny, Jim, that you mentioned liquidity and the ETF. I think we should turn to David now, because Alluvial is building a liquid staking protocol for institutions that, obviously by having a liquid staking token offers immediate liquidity on a staked position. So David, given your background, working as a node operator and working with infra, do you think a liquid staking protocol is a good mitigation around that centralization risk? Because there's a diverse set of node operators inside of a liquid staking protocol. Is that kind of a good first step in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is yes, I guess, but I can't speak to all liquid staking protocols. But yeah, at Liquid Collective, I mean, when you stake with us, what we do is we distribute that stake between our node operators, right? So right out the gate, you're getting some diversifications and de-risking that ETH, right? So in addition to that, we have standards that our node operators have to conform to in order to become node operators, and those include, meeting risk and performance standards, SLAs, compliance checks, know your business, and all of that, as well as client diversity targets that must be met before we onboard somebody. So, you can kind of say with confidence that if you're staking with us, then the Ethereum is de-risked by staking with multiple providers. I think that answers your question. Is that right?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's also what we've seen from, for example, Lido in their most recent wave of onboardings in the curated set. They specifically looked for certain geographical regions, so South America, Asia. I think they also put a preference on minority clients as well. So yeah, I guess if you're running a liquid staking protocol, it's kind of on you to curate the node operator set. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we ensure that, like we've touched on all the points in this call, that we ensure that nodes are in different geographical regions, client diversity, different node operators with different infrastructure will look after their nodes in different ways. So we've got diversity right out of the gate.
Sounds good. Yeah. Let's touch on the client diversity thing again, and we'll turn to Jorge. How much of a risk mitigation is it really for a node operator to use one of these minority clients, given that we don't really know how many other operators on the network are using those minority clients? Is that a great first step for a node operator, just to point to one of the smallest percentages on clientdiversity.org and say, I'm going to run that? Or is that also not really a good approach, do you think?
I think it's any sort of, even if we don't have perfect information, and to be honest, we're never going to have perfect information, right? There's always recent ways in which bias into the way we measure client diversity can come into the picture. The only alternative would be introducing some kind of really dystopian technology into Ethereum, where we're tracking what the nodes and the validators are doing at all times. And I don't even know how that would look like. But there's always going to be chances for people to sort of like, whatever mechanism you choose for reporting client diversity data, there's always going to be some way for people to opt out of that. Maybe they have to be very technical in order to fork a code base to make it happen, or maybe it's just as simple as clicking an opt-out button. Regardless, we're never going to get this kind of perfect information. So we have to make do with what we have. And the surveys and also like just general, conversations around what kind of software people are running show you some trends, right? And it showed that Geth has been the majority client for a long time. Maybe it's not a super majority at the moment. Well, it seems likely from looking at the sources that it's right below the 66% cap at the moment. And so that's been great progress that has been made, because now it means that if that is correct, which it seems very likely that it is, it means that some kind of software bug on Geth would not go up to the 66% cap in the number of validators, which is where some interesting things start to happen, right? Like 33% can lead to problems with liveness in the Ethereum protocol. 66% can lead to problems in another variety of ways. Like, for example, with the blocks that are finalized, if 66% of the whole network agrees on a block, then it can be finalized. But I digress. You coming back to your question, which was, okay, is it a good approach to go for or to choose a minority client, even if we don't have this kind of information or we don't have the certainty? I think it is. In the interest of time, I would redirect people to a really good article that was written by Dan Feist, which is called Ethereum Merge, Run the Majority Client at Your Own Peril. So here the sort of calculations and different doomsday scenarios are played out in much more detail that I think I can get into at this stage. And yes, also, one of the reasons why we have this multi-client design in Ethereum in the first place is to make sure we have mitigations against these kind of software bugs getting into the system. So we really should make the most out of it. We really should make sure that we move towards a future in which we have all these highly reliable client implementations that people can trust and that the community is trusting and is using. Of course, at Nethermind, we are doing our best to be a part of this with the execution client, and which is a highly performant and mature piece of software nowadays that, of course, people can check out and run and have the full confidence of a great team behind it. So in general, I would say, yes, the use of minority clients is going to bring down a lot of risks around what can happen with, these kinds of mishaps. And I think it's a very good step for the Ethereum network to be having these conversations and looking into these things.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for the answer. And makes sense. And we should continue to push minority clients. But the only thing better than running a minority client, of course, is node infrastructure and validator infrastructure where you can run multiple at the same time. So we've got Jim, who's behind Vouch and Dirk, and Oisín, who's behind DVT. So Jim, maybe you can just kind of, for people that aren't aware, what is Vouch and Dirk, and how does it de-risk staking in general?
Yeah, so we've got kind of two different areas where there are risks. One is, we've talked a lot about this, about client risks and similar. The other one is around key risk. So if we look at all of the slashings that have happened to date on mainnet, we don't know everything about them, but of all of the ones where people have reported issues, why did they get slashed, what happened, the answer seems to always have been the same, which is that they had multiple copies of the same keys on the same network, and they were doing this either because they had a system for resilience, or they were trying to migrate to somewhere else, whatever else. There's something basically where they're like, well, I put keys on A, I thought I moved them from A to B, but I left them on both. If you have the same key running in multiple locations, then you're really in trouble. And that has been the root cause of every single slashing event that we have understood to date. Now, Dirk is designed to protect against that while still providing resilience. So what you do is you do something called threshold signing. So you could say, for example, take your key for your validator, you break it into three. You have three separate individual servers running. Each one of those has a shard of this key. You need two of them to be able to agree, to be able to generate a valid signature. So for every operation that goes on, you talk to all three of these nodes, whichever two get back to you quickly enough and provide you with the data. You combine those key all the signature shards, you get a valid signature you can broadcast to the network. The critical thing here is that you can lose one of those 3 nodes and you can still keep going. So you have resiliency built into the system. Separately to that, you can have security built into the system, because we've talked about operational failure, but one of the big risks is, I had employee X who we kicked out of the company and they really don't like me and they have all of my private keys. Not a good situation to be in. So what you do is you have 3 different key holders, one's for each of the areas, and what happens is, again, if any one of those goes rogue, they can't do damage because they only have one of the 3 and they need at least 2 to be able to do that. Now, we've picked 2 of 3 as an example, but we can step that up to 3 of 5, 5 of 7, whatever it might be. So you can basically shed that risk around a much wider audience. They can be individuals who are all in the same company. They don't have to be. They can be independent entities. So Dirk protects sort of on that side of things. Vouch on the other side can talk to multiple beacon nodes. We talked about multiple consensus clients. Well, one of the nice things with Vouch is Vouch can then go and talk to all of them and then get a best result from it. So separate to what we're seeing with Dirk, which is around protection of keys, we're now seeing protection against, again, supermajority risk. So people running Vouch did not have supermajority risk with Geth, even if they used it, because they could say, I love Geth, it's amazing, it's fantastic, but hey, I'm not going to use it for my attestation data. So you literally can just say, okay, I'm going to use you for everything except attestation data. That means that I will never attest to a block unless Nethermind agrees to it as well, for example. And in those situations, you're protected on that side. What you do still have, though, is a single instance of Vouch. So Vouch is still a single piece of software talking to multiple consensus clients, sure, but they don't have to be multiple consensus clients. Users can set it up with just one, or they can have 2, but they can both be of the same variety, and as a result have the same impact. So although Vouch is very useful and has a lot of ability, one of the things it doesn't do is provide a consensus mechanism itself to agree on what's going to get signed. And that can matter. Historically, it hasn't mattered so much as we see correlated attestation penalties come in and similar. That type of thing will start to matter a lot more.
Okay, cool. So taking a simple 1 validator, 1 node setup and moving to a 1 validator, multiple nodes setup, and building in some diversity directly into the validator. Oisín, maybe you can chime in here. Distributed validator technology is maybe in the same vein, but a little different. Can you, given Jim's intro there about threshold signing, can you explain how DVT is different?
Yeah, absolutely. So DVT is very similar to Vouch in a lot of ways. Its main kind of differentiator is it goes that one step further in that, Vouch right now, it can talk to many full nodes and it can talk to multiple like remote signers, but there's still generally like one Vouch and, one set of certificates that, Dirk will like accept and like talk to. And with Charon and distributed validators, it's that last little layer. You can think of it almost like having multiple vouchers, but the main kind of upside there is that it's particularly designed to have multiple like entities and multiple operators running each of these pieces, more so than like one enterprise is like, I just want a really resilient software for like my enterprise. It's more, hi, we're 3 or 4 entities and we can run, validators together. So yeah, beyond that, in the technical perspective, it works fairly similar. Charon, its job is really only to decide on what the validators get shown to sign. But all of the validators are independent, like Vouch works. You can use Dirk underneath it. You can use Web3 Signer. So I describe it a lot like a multi-sig, like kind of a Gnosis safe or something. A lot of people are, very used to this. Keep a cold wallet, keep it really secure, but it's still like one single point of failure. Having something with the threshold really reduces the risk because you need maybe 2 of them out of 4 to go offline to have like a liveness issue, and 3 out of 4 to be compromised to have a safety issue. That's really the big premise behind distributed validators, is trying to kind of reduce the risks of failures, both on the liveness and the safety front.
Okay, so there's definitely technology out there to mitigate risks. And yeah, I would encourage everyone to check out Obol DV technology and also Attestant's Vouch and Dirk technology. So we're bumping up against our hour time limit here. I'd love to go on for another hour with you guys. It's been a great conversation. Hopefully we can do this again soon. But I think we'll wrap here. So yeah, I guess everyone's names are on screen here. So if any audience members are looking to get in touch, everyone's on Twitter, and also in the description of this event, they should have our Twitter handles, I believe. So thank you all again so much. This has been really great. So much brain power on this panel. I wish we could go longer, but I think we'll wrap here. Thanks to Liquid Collective for co-hosting with Obol, and we'll see you all next time. Hopefully the audience learned a lot today. Cheers.
Thanks for hosting, Max.
Thank you.
very much.